Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today, let's walk through the Arcanum development timeline. A few weeks ago, actually it may even be a couple months ago, I did the Fallout development timeline. People really liked that. In fact, Stavros Nikolaou asked, can you do an Arcanum one as well? And I was like, yes. Interestingly, about doing this, so this timeline was a lot harder for me to put together than the Fallout one. The Fallout one was basically looking at my notes and ordering them chronologically. This one was harder to put together because, interestingly, and I'll talk about this later in the video, there were no distinct roles on the Arcanum team. People did whatever they were good at. Because of that, we had no internal producer. Now, Leonard was the contact point with Sierra, and Sierra had their own producer. But for things, all the things that I did as the producer on Fallout, which was have schedules, project reports, meeting agendas, those things didn't happen inside of Troika. So when I was doing the Fallout development timeline, I just gathered together all the notes that I would write at home, usually on scraps of paper or whatever. And then the next day, I would write my project report that I would send to the executive producer based on my notes from that week. Those things don't exist. So I had to go through a lot of Troika stuff. I have images of every Troika machine. I went through like 3 or 4 machines when I was there, and I have images of them, disk images. But it contains a lot of, stuff. But it let me dive into things like contracts to see dates and milestones and things like that. So I could put together a good idea of how we made Arcanum. There are less photos than you might expect because I didn't have a digital camera until 2003. So almost all the photos I'm going to show during this are things that other people took pictures with film cameras and either gave me a copy or scanned it and sent me a copy. So I do have a few photos to show. This video also has far more reference videos in the description than any video I've ever done. I think there's 15 of them in there. And that's because there's so much context that you will need to understand everything that I'm talking about in this video. So if there's anything if anything I say and you're not quite sure what I mean, see if there's a reference video below and watch that, because there could be an entire documentary done on the creation of Arcanum. To get started, I'm going to have to start at the end of my time at Interplay, and you'll see why in a bit. So, as I've talked about, I wasn't really happy at the end of my stay at Interplay. In October of '97, Fallout shipped. Fallout 2 had already been started by another team. Their output wasn't what management expected, so I was asked to step in and do my own. Watch the video on why I left Fallout 2. I explain all of this. But the cogent points I want to pull out, or the relevant points, are I talked with Fergus as early as November of '97 about thinking about quitting. And I think he was a little surprised. It's hard to say, but he said he wanted me to think about it. I talked to both him and Brian Fargo in December of '97, within a few weeks, again about me thinking about quitting, me not being happy. We had tons of talks about how we could restructure the team, how we could institute a royalty system. I mean, there was a ton of discussions. But if you watch that video, you find out there was a lot of other things going on and people, glomming onto Fallout. And I was just like, blah. So at the very beginning of January, when I got back from break, the winter break, I basically said, hey, I'm going to leave. Now I had a vacation plan for the very next month, and I was going out of the country. So there's no way to cancel it, anything like that. So I said, look, I can either leave now or I can give you a 2-week notice. But keep in mind, I won't be here next week. Fergus asked me to stay to the end of January. I think, so the last day of January or the first day of February was my last day. And I said, sure, because what I did in those almost 3 weeks, after you subtract my week I was gone, I met with like Chris Avallone, who's going to take over a lot of narrative design on Fallout 2, Zeb Cook, who was going to come on as a designer. I basically talked with everyone who was going to step in and do things that I would have either done myself or overseen to just get everything as smoothly transitioned as possible. So February rolls around. I'm sitting at home. If you watch the video, you know Leonard and Jason submitted their resignation after they heard I did. We went around together and just tried to get hired locally. We talked to different companies. There were no takers at all, which I was surprised at. I'm not gonna not give you names because people seem to want to jump on people. So anyway, I do, in one of my rare dated notes from this time, February 5th, 1998, Jason got a call from someone at Blizzard, very high up in Blizzard, who basically was interested in hiring us. But he said, look, I'm getting told not to hire you. Basically warned. Yeah, bad things are going to happen to these guys. You don't want to be involved. I have no idea what it was. Again, I'm telling you something that Jason told me, that someone at Blizzard told him, that someone at Interplay told them. This is the biggest thing of telephone game ever. However, it was weird that we were having trouble getting any job offers. I mean, we just came off what was a really hot property. In fact, I've talked about in March of 98, I got a call personally from EA saying, hey, come up here and make Wasteland 2. And I was like, I just walked away from Fallout 2. Why would I move to go make Wasteland 2? So we finally just, we were talking for, February and all of March. And we're like, this is dumb. Let's just make our own company. So on April 1st, 1998, we incorporated Troika LLC. Yes, it was April Fool's Day, which is funny. It's not just the funny part. The irony of all this is we had never planned to make our own company, but after several companies warned us off, saying, oh, we were told not to hire you, that's the way we went. We were almost forced to do it. It's ironic in hindsight. I never saw myself running my own business. So in those last few months, I've been working really hard to write a new isometric engine, to write a new version of GNOL. Mine was called TIG, which is TIG isn't GNOL. Because as any programmer here will know, the first time you write something, that's never your best. And there were so many things that I wish were different about both those engines that I was working really hard about just writing engines. Right after we incorporated, I received a lawsuit threat from Interplay. And they said they were considering suing me for collusion and economic tortious interference. I have to read that every time. The first one, the collusion, was because they said because Leonard and Jason quit after I did, I must have coerced them into doing it, or that we were working together. And anybody who knows us know we all did what we wanted. The second one was even more ridiculous because it claimed that I demanded to be on Fallout 2, which was the exact opposite. I was begging not to be on it. That I quit unexpectedly, which they knew months before I left that I was thinking about leaving. And that I did all of those two things deliberately to set back development of Fallout 2, ignoring that I stayed for almost an entire month to try to get everything transferred correctly. So we talked to a lawyer. They sent a letter back basically saying, none of this is true. And we thought that was it. So I'll get back to that later. We then worked for months. We put together a 148-page design doc for a game that we were calling Epic. I don't know why I like that word so much. I always want to call my prototypes Epic. This is what would become Arcanum. We each worked from our homes. We would meet very frequently, a few times a week. Often we met at Jason's house because Jason lived close to Leonard. And I would just drive down there and we'd all meet. And we talk about design. We talk about tech stuff. I was excitedly telling about some new things I could do with the engine and with the TIG library because these were things we couldn't do before. But I said I'm rewriting it from scratch. There's all kinds of cool things. You can pick your color depth. You can do 8-bit games, 16-bit games, 32-bit games. You can do any resolution you want. You can ask the card what it can do and then say, give me your biggest resolution. A lot of really cool things. The memory management was really awesome. Anyway, during this, we weren't having any income. I had to remortgage my house just to get my mortgage payment down. And I'd only been there for 3 years, but anybody who's ever had a mortgage knows that the beginning of the mortgage is where it's mostly interest you're paying. So I restarted this 30-year mortgage pretty much knowing I still owed the same amount of money, and it reset it to a full 30 years, but I got my monthly payment down. And this is the only way I was figuring out how to survive because we weren't making any money. We had several publisher meetings during this time, and those weren't going very well either. In fact, one publisher, literally, the head guy started yelling at me in the middle of a meeting with about 8 or 9 people in it, telling me how stupid I was for still making things in C instead of C++. Before I couldn't even say anything, I was about to respond about, hey, I've done both, I know both, the C compiler does better optimization, C++ is slower, it hogs memory. Before I could say anything, Leonard starts yelling back at him. Leonard always has my back, but that probably didn't make that negotiation successful. But none of them had been. Even the ones that went well, nothing came of them. Fun times. So, sometime in July, we started talking with Sierra, with Scott Lynch, a VP at Sierra. In August, they basically told us, it'd be August of 98, that they were interested, but they wanted to see a working prototype in 90 days. Let me tell you what they wanted in that prototype. They wanted a sample level with combat against various creatures. They wanted spells. They wanted a structure that you could enter. And they said, yeah, either it's enterable and the roof flies off, or you instance into it. They wanted visual effects. They wanted a working UI. These were insane. We had very little code in place, just what I had already written since February. But at the same time, because I was writing that new engine and the new OS abstraction, and it was so much better, I felt like empowered. I was like, hey, this is going to work. I've done this before. I got this. However, I had never written particle effects before. And I had decided for some reason that we needed real-time shadows. Yeah, we had a lighting model baked in the original Arcanum. So we ended up hiring Chris Jones, who was the other lead on Fallout. He would come work at my place every day. Leonard and Jason continued to work at their homes. We would continue to meet regularly. And we did it. We got them a prototype with all the things in it they wanted. And we ended up signing a full contract in October. I checked it. It targeted a ship date in April of 2000. So, spoiler warning, we didn't make that ship date. In late October 98, we rented an office in Irvine and started hiring more people. In fact, we hired almost everybody that we were going to hire. The only people we hired later were some QA people. And I think we switched out an artist at some point. But the whole game was made by 14 people. So it wasn't a lot of people to have to go hire. The place we rented was absolutely filthy, but we got a good deal on it. So we had it professionally cleaned. It was nasty. It was dirty. There were stains everywhere. There were stickers all over the bathrooms, but the place had like 4 bathrooms and a shower. It was great. We did such a good job of cleaning it that the company renting it to us decided they wanted it for themselves and didn't renew our 1-year lease. By the way, side note, that place was haunted. It was weird. People had told me, some people had stayed there late and told me they heard weird noises and it sounded like people were in the office. And I'm like, I stayed late one night. I heard some noises. I heard someone laugh. It sounded like a woman was laughing in the office next to me. I went down. There was one big hallway that kind of went in a U. I went down. There was nobody there. The windows were not openable. All the doors were locked. But when I was walking back to my office, the blinds in one room, which are inside the building, were moving. But the ventilation wasn't on. And I'm like, okay, this is creepy. The security systems detected no motion, nothing. And I'm like, okay, so I went back to my office and cranked up my ambient music, which I always listen to when I coded, and just tried not to think about that. By the way, that first office, it was the first of 4 offices we rented in the just over 6 years we existed. And that was because either they wouldn't renew it because they, like that one company wanted to move back, or in the other cases, we'd be at some place in a year and then they'd jack up the rent a lot, thinking we wouldn't move. And we're like, we already had a budget, a defined budget. It wasn't like we could go back and say, hey, we want more money for rent. So we would just move. So we moved 4 times in 6.5 years. I also make it clear, how do we make Arcanum with just 14 people? I have videos on this, but the answer is one word: tools. We made a lot of tools that leveraged what a few people could do. We had our world editor, which made it really easy to make local maps. It was much more user-friendly than the one we had on Fallout. It was also way easier to generate world maps with it. The world map in Fallout had to be generated by hand and brought into the world. Ours, you could paint a world map with terrain type, and then it would procedurally generate it. Sock Monkey Script Maker made it really hard for people to write degenerate code. They figured out how to do it anyway, but it made it harder. And then our dialogue system, which I explained we did in Excel, but we had dialogue opcodes which went into generated dialogue banks, which made it possible for a few people to just do so many things. And that's the secret to good tools. It's leverage. Also, because just a few people made all the content, our content felt very tight. It felt less disjointed than bigger teams sometimes make. If you ever play a game and it feels like one town, it doesn't feel like the other town, or the humor in one area is not like the humor in the other, it's probably because there was a big team and it didn't have as much oversight. We didn't need that oversight because we were a tiny team. Everybody knew what everybody else was doing. So that went well. Which, by the way, I should probably talk about credits at this point. Because so many people were doing so many different things, we just, as credits, said, here's who made Arcanum at Troika. We didn't give any titles. People did a lot of things. Owned areas that were quite different. The lines got blurred between what you would call a designer, a programmer, and an artist. We had artists who did animation but also wanted to write dialogue. We had programmers who wrote combat code but also wanted to design quests. Sure thing. This led to sites after Arcanum shipped. I even wrote down Moby Games, IMDb, and Metacritic all just started guessing what the roles were. Because back then, names had to be associated with roles. So I've been an animator, a voice director, and an actor in Arcanum. And I did none of those things. A lot of these have been cleaned up since, but back in 98, 99, I would go look up Arcanum, and the funniest stuff was online. Because everybody was doing this stuff at the very beginning when we hired everyone, we paid everyone the same salary. We tried to only hire senior experienced people. We gave everyone the same salary. We agreed to split royalty, and we did. That was really cool. In fact, I found a note from that time that I wrote, that I just came home one day and I wrote, I love this small team vibe at Troika. I love the TV room where sometimes we sit and eat and watch television shows together. I love the kitchen that we've stocked with free food and drinks. We even have a daycare center. Now, I didn't make use of that, but the way it worked was we provided space for it. Troika did. And then people who wanted to bring in their kids, which was fun to have your kid there with you, they would jointly pay a daycare worker. We never had, I think, more than 4 kids in there at once. Later on, when I adopted rescue dog, he made the mistake of going in there one time, and both Jason's little girl and Leonard's little girl grabbed his fur and pulled it, and he was like, I'm out of here. He never growled, he never got aggressive. He left that daycare room and he never ever returned. Anyway, as if things weren't busy enough, I agreed to co-teach a class at UCI in the spring of 99. So this would be April, May, June of 99. I co-taught ICS 180G at UCI with Professor Dan Frost. I mean, I look back at this and I'm like, how? I was so busy. Where did I think, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll teach a class a few times a week. And I have to make, lecture plans and all these things. The next year I did it again, but I only guest lectured a few times and came back to judge the project. By the way, some of those projects were so good, Troika ended up hiring people from both classes. And that went really well. September of 1999 is when I contacted Edward R.G. Mortimer, who's one of my favorite Judges Guild designers. There's a Judges Guild video linked below. He wrote The Beast of Blackwater Lake in the Book of Treasure Maps 3. I was floored by that. And you can see the video. I just loved it. So I contacted him, flew him out, contracted him, and he worked between November of 99 and April of 2000. He wrote many of the generated dialogue banks that the opcodes pulled from. So that was Mortimer's contribution to Arcanum. Also in September of 99, Sierra started doing layoffs. They were having a bunch of financial issues. They did layoffs and a bunch of cutbacks. Leisure Suit Larry 8 and Space Quest 7 both got canceled. We were terrified that we were going to get canceled. We survived, and Homeworld, which was being made by Relic, survived. I love to think at the time, I'm like, oh, of course they believe in us so much. And I think they did. But also you have to remember we were a small team and we were cheap. So, and so I think all that helped to let us survive. And also, I just want to point out at this point, Sierra was a really, really good publisher. We loved working with them, and we would have continued working with them if they hadn't run into these issues. They gave us really wide latitude with Arcanum. Keep in mind, first-time company, making a very huge, feature-rich game, having only made one game before, Fallout. We had a complex character creation and leveling. We had branching story. We had so many side quests, because we had side quests for skill mastery. We had over 40 end slides in this game. There was so much branching. There were so many things we were trying to cover in end slides. We also, no single character build could see all of those end slides. It just couldn't happen. They gave us full control of the box covers, of the ads, of the manual. Leonard and Jason handled a lot of the cover and ads, although we did have a comic book artist named Glenn Fabry. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He did art for some of them. Leonard talks about this in the part 2 chat I did with him. I'll link that below. I wrote most of the manual, threw a recipe in there. I have a video about my recipes. They also let us keep the code rights. So even though they would own the IP, we own the code. And that's the code we use to do Temple. That's the only reason we could do Temple so quickly. About this time, we changed the name, the working title of the game, from Epic to Arcanum. The team talked about several names. They included Moribund World, which I think we had also considered for Fallout. Flying Monkeys, that came from Jason. I remember that one. And Remains of the Day. We finally settled on Arcanum. I don't remember who thought of Arcanum. I do know that the subtitle was because I loved subtitles, and I also loved Judges Guild modules with subtitles, and one of them had a subtitle called Of Skulls and Scrap Faggot Green. I can say that word. And I suggested of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, and people liked it, and it got put in. And so to this day, anybody who thinks that's a bad subtitle, that's on me. If you think it's a good subtitle, woohoo. Sierra wanted multiplayer. Our original, and that would require real-time combat. I didn't want to do multiplayer turn-based. The original design was turn-based. So I originally had designed a connection between turn-based and real-time that was correlated inversely through action points. What that meant was actions that took more action points in turn-based would animate more slowly in real-time than ones that used fewer action points. Then my intention was to balance this correlation factor before we shipped. None of that happened. So another spoiler, none of that happened. Real-time and turn-based were highly unbalanced. Around this time, too, we were having a bit of frustration with Sierra QA. Not that they were bad, but we were used to internal QA. We had internal QA at Fallout. It's just easier. I would go and talk to the internal QA people every day. I had meetings with the lead every week. So we hired internal people. We had 3 people. It was really hard because, we couldn't give them a walkthrough. There were so many different things. But those 3 people, Scott, Sissy, and Tiffany, they worked super hard. Arcanum would have been way more buggy without those 3. April of 2000, the second lawsuit threat came in from Interplay. This was to all of Troika. They claimed we stole tech, and they were upset that we claimed to be creators in an ad. Now, we redirected them to Sierra and said, Sierra made the ad. Anything you want, talk to them. For the tech thing, I let them come over with an Interplay programmer who was familiar with GNOME. I said, come on over, look at our code. Come look at it. It was different. He came over with Fergus. Fergus just stood back while me and the programmer kind of pair programmed, went through the code. I showed him all the cool things it could do, the new bit depth, some of the new cool things it could handle with Windows, because I was done with DOS, and I was also done with Apple. Apple gave us very little support on Fallout. I wasn't even intending to make another Apple game. So even though TIG was only wrapping Windows, but all the different flavors of Windows. And he, at one point, we probably spent a couple hours on it, and then he just turned to Fergus and said, this is all different, and it's a lot better. I wish we could do some of these things. So that went away. Later, and I don't have a date on this, we got another letter. And this time, I got a different lawyer. I got somebody who was a really good friend of mine from college, who is now a top lawyer at one of the top 3 law firms in the country. This he basically wrote a letter that basically said, "Hey guys, from now on, all correspondence is public, so you have no expectation of privacy. You send us one more letter, we send it to PC Gamer and anybody who cares. Second, this is starting to borderline on harassment, so one more letter, countersuit. And second, and a third thing he said was, I've noticed your lawyer is sending baseless accusations of things that have already been disproved. If he continues, we will be contacting the California Bar Association." Everything stopped. So that's the last thing I want to talk about that. Everything stopped. Never heard anything again. So, by the way, another ironic, amusing follow-up. Interplay lost the Fallout code, and they contacted me 2 years later to find out if I had it. And I was like, I don't have it, and I proved we weren't using it. They finally did find it in an old machine, and I think it was my old machine that was still stored in a closet somewhere. But to me, I thought that was ironic that they thought I had the code. I proved I didn't use it or keep it, and then they still thought I had it. Anyway, same month, April of 2000, we did Editor's Day, which is when Sierra invited a bunch of press to preview Arcanum and interview us at the Magic Castle up in LA. It was really cool because the president of Sierra was a magician, and you had to be a magician to do events there. So we did that. It was interesting. A gender controversy started after Editor's Day. And 2 things triggered this. One, when we were making the character creation, I noticed that the only thing that didn't affect the game was you picking a gender. And later on, I'd find out there were dialogues to check gender. And this was interesting too. People used to say that your name didn't affect it, but your name did affect the game. I did random number generation based off your name. I think people figured that out after a long time, but that meant everything on character creation affected the game. So we made, if you picked female, your attributes would change. One would go up by 1, one would go down by 1. But you could always just flip it back. It was no point difference. You could undo it. People got really upset. Now, we already didn't have dwarf and half ogre female models. We knew, for lore reasons, we knew we were going to include them in the game. However, for memory reasons, we had to toss out more. And we ended up tossing out female halflings and female gnomes. We talked about tossing out the male ones, but we had already had characters in that were male and had been written that way. And the gnome ones, for a particular reason, kind of had to stay male. So we threw out the female ones. People got really upset. That finally blew over. But I quickly learned I'm not going to do that again. I'll figure out how to solve the memory issue before I want to wade into a fight like that again. September of 2000 is when I rescued my dog from the animal shelter. His name was Cooter. He was I think he was Belgian Shepherd. We didn't know it. He was a big mutt. Really good dog. Really good dog. I would bring him to work with me every day. Super well behaved. He attended many meetings. Very quiet. Just would sit in the corner and watch what was going on. Just happy to be there. He had separation anxiety, so it was hard for me to leave him at home. My neighbors would say he'd cry and bark a lot. I'd bring him to work. Nothing. No issues at all. So by this time, we were really behind in shipping. So early in the summer, Sarah said, look, we're going to ship as soon as the bug count drops to a certain point. Not necessarily 0 and not necessarily if the game is balanced. At the same time, this is when the entire development team, besides me, wanted me to switch over to the 1-point system. There's a whole video about that below. So much stuff going on. Finally, in August of 2001, they're like, we've got to be done. And they sent it off to the duplicator. Well, guess what? September 11th, 2001 happened. Our stuff had already been duplicated and shipped out, but things stopped. Shipping halted. Stores were closed. So our first month sales were really, really bad. We were all incredibly depressed, besides being demoralized over the whole September 11th thing. However, month 2, it picked up, and it kept picking up. We did really well. We got royalty checks. We divided it among the team like we said we would. Everybody was super happy. We started a sequel. I've got a video about how we talked about Journey to the Center of Arcanum. Scott Lynch, who had been a VP at Sierra, he had moved over to Valve. He was the chief operating officer there, and he thought we should negotiate Arcanum 2 using Valve's source engine. We also evaluated Lithtech for Monolith, and Tim Sweeney and Mark Rain came by from Epic to show us Unreal. This was October of 2001, and Unreal looked really good back then. In fact, I think we would have gone with Unreal if it wasn't for this amazing offer to use Source. So, and spoiler alert, 15 years later, Leonard and I made The Outer Worlds using Unreal. So The sequel, which I talked about, the Journey to the Center of Arcanum, suddenly it just was canceled. We weren't working on it anymore. They were like, nope, we're not going to do this. However, they had already bought the Lord of the Rings IP, and they had us start working on that. They loved it. They sent a Lord of the Rings estate expert to come talk to us. Everything was going well. And suddenly they said, oh, we like this so much, we're pulling it internally. And then they stopped contacting us. They wouldn't respond to our emails and calls. We just didn't hear from them. Then Atari and Activision called us in the very same week. Atari was working with WotC, and they wanted to know if we could do a D&D game based on 3rd edition using the same engine we used in Arcanum, which, remember, we owned the rights to that code. So there's a video below about making Temple. Then Activision contacted us and wanted us to make Bloodlines, and Source could be part of that deal. So both of those went through. We bifurcated into 2 teams. Leonard and Jason and most of the Arcanum team went on to Bloodlines, and I and a few of the Arcanum team, and I had to staff up, and so did they, in fact, went on to Temple of Elemental Evil. And that's where, at that point, we were being paid by a new company. We couldn't do a lot of fixes on Arcanum, and Sierra was no longer approving our fixes. So we couldn't do any bug fixes that they wouldn't approve. So boom, we were now on 2 new projects. And that was the end of Arcanum, of Steamworks, and Magic Obscura. So I hope you liked this development timeline. I hope it wasn't too long.